More than 15 years since construction finally wrapped up, the Big Dig is still notorious for delays and cost overruns and for taking way longer and costing way more than anyone had planned. But as Ian Coss explores in his GBH podcast named after the infamous project, the results of the Big Dig are a different story.
1, 2, 3, go.
Yeah! It was a long time, but the results are spectacular.
I mean, it is absolutely beautiful around here now.
Do you think it was worth it?
Yes, most definitely.
So is it time to jettison that old narrative? And what might the Big Dig tell us about future ambitious infrastructure projects? Ian Coss joins me now. Thanks for coming in, and congratulations on the success of this podcast. I know it hit #1 on the Apple podcast charts, correct?
The history charts.
History charts, thank you. And there's some other impressive numbers attached, but there's a real appetite for this.
Apparently, all these years later, people in Boston and elsewhere, I don't know, still want to hear about the Big Dig.
I want to know what made you think that was going to be the case, because I assume you thought there was going to be an audience when you embarked on this. I will confess, when I heard that GBH was involved with the Big Dig podcast, I thought, oh, so much has already been written and said about that. And, what can we do new here that people will want to consume? And obviously, you did a whole bunch. How did you know there was an appetite?
Well, for me, I mean, there was so much written and said about this project at the time. But then I think there's been, I don't want to say a silence, but a bit of a void since then. You know, there were a few books that came out around the time when the project was wrapping up, but there really hadn't been anyone who took a look at the whole scope of the project with some distance, with some perspective, with the knowledge of, you know, not just how it came to be, but how it played out in the long term. And it just felt like it was a good time to do that, not only because of, you know, the distance we now have from that story, but the relevance that story has to our present moment. You know, Biden's infrastructure bill, all the pressure around, you know, renewable energy and improving our transit system. It just felt like now was a time to revisit that story.
I want to get back to the relevance piece and what your takeaway ultimately is when it comes to whether we can do this sort of thing again in the future. But some viewers will know that there's a ton of engineering detail in here because it's a very complicated engineering story. But there's also just a ton of political content because it's a deeply political story involving a number of different actors.
It's Boston.
It's Boston, and I want to roll just a little bit from episode 4. Where you point out that the reality as the Big Dig started brewing here in Massachusetts was not the reality of today's Massachusetts. Let's take a look.
Great.
If you think of Massachusetts as a high-income state or as a hub for biotech firms and startups, then I'm here to tell you the state you're thinking of is a relatively new phenomenon. In the mid-1970s, our unemployment rate was 12%, the highest of any industrial state. By 1988, it was 3%, the lowest of any industrial state. That turnaround came to be known as the Massachusetts Miracle.
His fellow governors voted him the most effective governor in America.
Dukakis presided over most of this remarkable period. He was elected governor in 1974, again in 1982, and again in 86. Then he rode the glow of the miracle all the way through the presidential primaries in 1988.
He wiped out huge budget deficits and led an economic turnaround they call a miracle.
I love the back-to-back shot of him jogging and then hopping on the tee. That's the episode where, if I remember right, you say the idea that there are clear good guys and bad guys in this story starts to break down.
Yes.
How so?
I think... So the origins of this story, of the Big Dig, are really in activism, citizen activism, right? The idea of tearing down the central artery, this hulking elevated highway, and so much of the political momentum behind it came from local people and neighborhoods pushing back against highways, right? So that's kind of one current, right, that's flowing into making this project happen. Then you fast forward a few years, the project has gotten federal funding, right? It's no longer the scrappy underdog. Now it's, as one of the project's architects described it, now we're the kid walking onto the playground with a $5 bill hanging out of our back pocket, and everybody wants something, right? So there's this interesting moment, at least very interesting for me, in the late 1980s when the kind of the politics around the project really shift, and you start having a lot of local opposition to the project. Some environmental groups, some neighborhood groups, some property owners who are upset about how it'll impact their property. And so what had been this sort of, like I said, underdog story, the whole city rallying around this unlikely project.
Let's make the built environment better.
Right. Turns into something a lot more complicated, and there's all this sort of like internal struggles within the city.
You just mentioned that the sort of original impetus for this comes from citizen activists who are trying to make Boston more livable, and it involves opposition to another big project.
Right.
Again, I want to roll a little bit of audio and video involving that Genesis period, and then we'll come back and talk more about it. Let's take another look.
By January of 1969, when Francis Sargent took his oath as governor, the GBC protesters were ready.
About 2,000 folks show up in front of the State House saying, "What are you going to do about this road? What are you going to do about this, Sergeant?"
What had started as a small group of Cambridge residents pushing back against a single road had grown into a radical challenge to the state's entire road-building policy. And this was the coming out party for the movement. All the players, all the factions, gathered in one place.
It spilled down the stairs of the State House over into Boston Common.
The fire department came, people from every neighborhood in Boston.
Anstey Benfield led a march over from Cambridge and addressed the crowd.
Hello, an area of 15,000 residents. This road will go right through the middle of it.
So we see in that clip the Stop I-95 graffiti. Yeah. Obviously, I-95 was not stopped, but it is not now what it was going to be. For people who don't know the history, what was it going to be?
Yeah. So I love this. If you look at a map of Interstate 95, right, it runs from Florida to Maine, and if you zoom in, it goes through basically every big city on the East Coast, right? It goes through D.C., it goes through Baltimore, it goes through New York City. It does not go through Boston, right? If you look at the map, there's this squiggle, and it goes around Boston and then keeps going on the other side. And that's because of that, protest we just saw. It's because of that activism. It was supposed to go through Jamaica Plain, through Roxbury, through the South End.
Then Cambridge, right?
Yeah, then it would link up with this road called the Inner Belt that would cut through Cambridgeport, Central Square, Charlestown, and then continue on the other side. So it would have, just cut a huge slice through the middle of the city.
One of my favorite parts in terms of what I've heard so far of the podcast, what I've seen, is you talking about the disparate groups of people from those neighborhoods who got together to make that not happen. And there's some really fascinating footage. You and I were talking before this segment started. I was saying I didn't really cover anything Big Dig related until the very end. But I did cover Chuck Turner during his time on the city council, and for people who know Chuck Turner and are interested in Boston city politics, there's some remarkable footage of Chuck Turner leading opposition to that I-95 plan.
And I think just to add one bit, that's so important to remember, this movement, the anti-highway movement, is happening in 1969, 70, 71. This is just a few years before the busing crisis, right, which I know WGBH has been doing a lot on as we mark the 50th anniversary of that period, right? And so just imagine that you have, in that moment, activists from Roxbury, activists from largely white suburbs coming together to fight against these highways together, activists from East Boston, activists from Cambridge, right on the eve of what will become this incredibly divisive
just
period.
A few years later. That's really, I hadn't thought of that. That's a terrific point. Do you think that this story that you tell here reflects dynamics that are unique to Massachusetts, or could you imagine a similar project playing out over a few decades in a similar way in another American city?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the basic kind of pieces are there in many cities, right? Many cities have big elevated highways that, destroyed neighborhoods. And many cities would have and would still like to put those, remove those highways. I think one of the pieces that you cannot ignore that makes Massachusetts and Boston different and makes this project happen is the sheer amount of political power concentrated in this state at that time.
Yeah.
So in the 1980s, I mean, you know this, there's this incredible constellation of Tip O'Neill, right? Speaker of the House. He's been in Congress for 30 years. He's risen to its highest post, right? You've got Senator Ted Kennedy, scion of this legendary American political family. You've got Michael Dukakis, who I think people today might remember as the guy who lost the presidential election, but before that, he was an incredibly popular and well-known governor, right? So you've got so much, political power on the local and federal level that's pushing to make this project happen. And I don't know that any other state could have wielded or pulled together that much power.
You remind people in the podcast that President Reagan vetoed this, right? And yet it became a reality anyway.
Exactly. And I think a telling counterexample is that New York City actually had its own version of the Big Dig, a similar kind of project that was called Westway, that would have put much of the West Side Highway underground. Again, similar impetus, similar vision, similar challenges. That project died in Congress, essentially, in the 1980s.
So I know the big overarching question that you float in this series is whether the United States is still capable of doing big, ambitious projects of the sort that the Big Dig was.
Yeah.
I don't want to get you to make people not listen to it, but what's your takeaway? What did you end up deciding the answer is?
I mean, it's not a yes or no answer, and we spent 9 episodes trying to tease that question apart and understand all the complexities of it. So I think what I came away feeling, though, from this story is that the Big Dig captures so many of the challenges, so many of the reasons why big visionary projects don't happen, or why they're over budget, why they're behind schedule. And those reasons are not unique to the Big Dig, right? It's not, my reading of the history is not that this was just one greedy contractor or one corrupt politician that spoiled the whole thing. My reading of the history is that these were systemic forces that at every step of the way hindered and blocked this project as it attempted to make its way to completion. So looking at that history, it is kind of daunting, right, to imagine it undertaking ambitious projects like this today. But I think it also provides some real cause for optimism in that it did happen, right? Despite all the flaws, despite all the delays, it did happen. And I think there is a real inspiration to be taken from the way this idea, this vision was sort of handed like a baton, from one administration to the next, one leader to the
sometimes
next.
From enemy to enemy.
Sometimes from enemy to enemy, exactly. And it did endure, it did survive, and it did transform the city. And I don't mean to say that there are no critiques to be made of the project or how it was executed, but in my view, is undeniably transformative.
Ian Coss, congratulations again on what is a fascinating project, and thanks for talking with me about it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.